So here is our online lecture for the chapter on critical approaches. Hang on to your seat. We have some intense stuff to cover that we will talk about in more detail in class. So this is a pretty dense chapter, but I think it's also a fairly accessible chapter, and you'll have a chance to we'll have a chance to discuss some of these concepts more in detail in class, but I'm just going to cover the basics and what I think is particularly important and what was left out. So the critical framework, or the critical approach in general, which can also be called critical thinking or critical methodologies or critical discourse, just the word critical is always in there, is concerned with power and control. So who has it, who doesn't, what kinds of power there are, things like structural power, which is, who's the boss, interpersonal power, which is maybe who's the most popular, and or charismatic, referent power, which is informational power, which means who's holding on to the important information, who do you go to when you need to get something done or figure something out. This framework also looks very deeply at privilege, which is something we don't necessarily talk about in the business world a lot, but is heavily embedded in business culture. And the other thing to think about as well, and we discussed this briefly in class, but while the previous frameworks we've looked at seem to be predicated on an assumption that organizations are good, moral, something we should be doing, the critical approach does not make that assumption. It makes the assumption that organizations are amoral, so that the people within the organizations may be acting morally or immorally, and the assumptions upon which the organizations are formed by those people may not be moral or advantageous assumptions for many of the people engaged. One thing that the chapter doesn't talk a whole lot about, the chapter focuses on what it calls deep structures. And by that, I think she means structural power that's really embedded in society very deeply. But that's sometimes called like the macro lens. It's the really high level social lens. There's a little bit in the book, but something we might talk about also in class is there are power dynamics on psychological, interpersonal, and organizational levels. And so power is something that suffuses our lives in a way that happens on a person-to-person basis. It happens in our own minds because of how we've come to perceive and react to power based on our own individual experiences and our experiences in our families of origin, so in a psychological way, and then also at the organizational level of your individual organization. And this clues back into culture a little bit, how your organizational culture interprets the norms of power that are prevalent in organizational culture as a whole are going to vary somewhat. Okay, so on table 6.1, there's a nice summary of sources of power. And this one's good because it goes through sort of the more individualized forms of power and also the greater ones. So just to talk about a couple of them: formal authority, very clear. Control of scarce resources. So scarce resources can be human resources. I don't really like that term. But if you only have one designer who's capable of doing a certain type of work, like maybe who speaks Korean, and you need something designed for a Korean company, if you are controlling how much work that person does and for whom, you have control over a scarce resource. It can also be money, budgetary stuff. How you use organizational rules, structure, and regulations. So that's sometimes people are really good at sort of molding those things to their own uses, whereas others kind of follow them in a way that they think is literal. Let's see what else is interesting in there. Control of knowledge and information, which is also called referent power. Able to cope with uncertainty, that is certainly a source of power. There are people who need everything to be clearly defined, and there are people who can kind of handle a lot of uncertainty or ambiguity. Control of technology, that's a big one. Have you ever met people in the IT department who basically don't speak English? They use acronyms for everything so that they hold the keys to whether or not you get your problem fixed, when you might actually be able to handle it yourself. But if they're only going to speak in acronyms and they're not going to explain to you like what's actually going on, then they hold all the power. Interpersonal alliances, networks, and control of informal organizations. So most org development type classes, a chapter on power would focus on that. It would not be looking at structural inequality at all. It would be looking at how if I am friends with the CEO, I might get special favors. Or if I have an alliance among certain managers, we may be able to band together to convince someone higher up that we need, more employees or more budget. And so the sort of the best and the worst of what we think of as politics and organizations is kind of summed up in that one bullet point. In the informal organization, a good word for that is a grapevine. So the grapevine is the informal organization. It's, all the sort of lines of gossip and channels through which we find out stuff about people, and sometimes less principled people will use that information as currency. So that's what we'd be talking about for this whole chapter if this was a different book, but luckily we have a book that also talks about structural inequality, so we get to talk about that. Symbolism and manager meaning, we'll talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about gender. And so control of organizational discourse is the next thing I want to cover from the book. And it's the idea, and I think this harkens a lot back to culture. So when I talked about manufacturing culture in the last chapter, I think control of organizational discourse is really similar. It's the idea of how people consciously or unconsciously accumulate power by either directly or tacitly implying what we talk about, how we think about our organization. And so in an organization I used to work at and one of our students works at, there was sort of this mythology where even if there was a lot of political posturing and ugliness going down in your department, there was this myth that the CEO of the company was this brilliant, kind, moral person, and if something bad was going on, he probably didn't know about it, and he was probably a victim of circumstance. But he was always a good guy, and it was always somebody lower down the chain's fault if something ugly was going on. Well, that's control of organizational discourse. I'm not sure who controlled that. I guessed it was probably the executives below the CEO who kind of created that impression. But that was definitely a way that we sort of dumbed down our feelings of discontent when things were bad, because we always thought, oh, well, but the CEO is a great guy and he's done great things and it's a good company, and so the fact that, my department at the moment is a cesspool, it's not his fault. He's not ultimately responsible, when in reality that's discourse, that's not reality. If he's in control of the company, then it is his responsibility. So that's kind of an example about that. Ideology is one of the major terms. Ideology, hegemony, and emancipation, those are sort of the big terms for this chapter, and so just to kind of summarize them, ideology is the idea of controlling what people perceive as existing. So what we sort of see and don't see, if you think about those organizational blinders you have on, and one day something happens that just completely flies in the face of how you think about how your organization works, and those blinders come off, and then suddenly you're like, whoa, what I saw before and what I'm seeing now are two different things. You may have examples of that. I sure do. The book says what we think of as good. I think it's also what we think of as bad, and what we think of as possible, and I add as impossible, because I think that really the most powerful way to control someone's behavior is not to tell them how to be, it's to tell them how not to be. So if you think back to when you were a kid, there was someone, almost all of us have someone in the family or associated with the family that we're not supposed to be like when we grow up. And I believe that that's a much more powerful force than the role model idea. I think our parents are role models, and we unconsciously take on their behaviors, but I also think that the idea of don't be like those people, or don't be like that person, don't be like that aunt or that uncle or that cousin, in our families of origin is definitely a way that organizational discourse is controlled. And so the idea of what we're supposed to feel badly about or think ill of is a big part of ideology. Hegemony is sort of the broader idea of how rules are made and transmitted. So something to think about is in organizations, who sets the rules versus in government, who sets the rules. So theoretically, in government, we set the rules. We vote. We vote on judges sometimes. We vote for laws or against laws. We have some kind of agency or control in what our social rules are. And we have some control in how those rules are changing. So if we think about how some social norms have changed over the last 10 years, if you think about something like gay marriage, which politicians wouldn't have even talked about 15 years ago, it wouldn't have even been on the table. And now it's becoming something that even the right has realized they can't, you can't continue to claim that a certain group of people aren't allowed the same kind of privilege of another group of people because they're considered wrong or broken in some way. So that's a social norm that changed over the last 10 years, which is now turning into a legal norm that is changing through lawsuits and through law changes and protection law changes and the striking down of other laws. So in our governmental system, we have some control over what those rules are. And as we change as a culture, we also change the rules. In organizations, do we as individuals make the rules if we are not in either the C-suite or on the board of directors? Very little. We may make some rules about how things happen in our department or some process rules, but in terms of what is acceptable and how we adapt to the rules that are given to us, if you look at an organizational system and compare it to a governmental system, what kind of system do our organizations have? Is it democratic? No. Is it collective? Not really. So something to think about in this idea is, what is it about capitalism that makes it okay for us to give up our autonomy? What aspect of that may be hegemonic? So for what reason and what has influenced us as a culture, as individuals, to give up our power to other people who we did not elect, other than the fact that they're paying us money? But what gives us, what influences us to give up our rights in a way that we don't give up our rights in our larger social world? So why is that acceptable in our work world, where something like a monarch or a totalitarian political system is not okay? It's a particularly interesting question in the United States when there's so much rhetoric that's anti-socialist, anti-collectivist, and yet our government really is based on some form of representation, whereas our corporations are really little fiefdoms where we have very few rights. So it's just something to think about when you're thinking about how we talk about power in organizations. And then emancipation is about becoming aware of ideology and hegemony and then being able to resist. So an example is what we talked about in chapter 2, systematic soldiering. is a form of resistance, right? There's a whole lot of control going on, and people collectively decide that they are going to resist that control for whatever reason by controlling the amount of output so that they can't keep raising the bar, which means that you're making less and less money for your labor if they keep raising the bar. So another easy to understand form of resistance is unionization. Unions have been regarded pretty negatively, I think, over the last 20 years. Certainly in Texas, unions are not a thing, but that also seems to be changing because the minimum wage hasn't risen since 2009. Full-time workers at the minimum wage make $15,000 a year, which is well below the poverty level. So if you have, one or even two people working and you have a few kids, you're pretty much screwed if you're making the minimum wage. And then we have a gridlocked government where the minimum wage is kind of a big issue and everyone's arguing about it. So it's not changing anytime soon because there's so much posturing around that issue. And to me, it looks like unions are becoming a thing again because in light of a gridlocked government, you can't look for legal recourse. And so the way that people gain power over a hegemonic corporate system is to band together and control the supply of labor. So that's sort of the point of unions, is that if you take a bunch of low-paid workers and get them together and they say, hey, we're not going to work at all and we're going to cut off your supply of labor unless you pay us a living wage, then that is a form of a counter-organization, and it's also an emancipatory way of recognizing and facing down ideological and hegemonic forces that take away your ability to have control over your work. Okay. I found the section on concerted control kind of bizarro. It sounds very utopian. This is just my opinion, and you might think it's great. And if you have experience with a concerted control organization, I would like to hear about it. But for me, a lot of the language in that section seemed very utopian and quasi-spiritual, which sort of takes us back to the idea that our highest form of self-realization happens through our work. And so maybe if there's a way that people collectively decide this, and it's not a top-down organization, it might work. There are organizations that are co-ops that are collectively owned or collectively governed, and I've worked with some of those. But I think they're pretty hard to do in the United States because from a legal standpoint, you cannot incorporate under those types of organization. You can only incorporate as like, a corporation, a C corporation, or a partnership, or there's a couple others. But in any case, they all require that you have, a president and a secretary, and that power cannot really be spread equally throughout all of the employees from a legal standpoint, which makes it difficult if you are in an organization that's trying to act cooperatively. Because if somebody decides they're not getting enough of the cookies, they can hire a lawyer, and the lawyer can argue based on their legal formation rather than how they imagine themselves to be formed. So I'm not so sure about the concerted control section. I'll be curious to see what you guys have to say about it. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is feminist theory. This part of the chapter is interesting. Feminist theory is different than feminism in the sense that it is an emancipatory viewpoint on any type of research involving any type of sociological research. And so the idea behind feminist theory is that we look for structural inequality, regardless of whether or not it's structural inequality that damages women's ability to make, healthy decisions or have a healthy workplace, or whether it's another marginalized group of people. However, half the population is female, and most women work these days, and so it's pretty easy to look, at least at first blush, at how there are differences between how men and women are treated in the workplace. Certainly there's wage gap stuff, but there's also some more subtle things like table 6.2 talks about examples of ways organizations normalize sexual harassment and domination. And I've certainly seen and experienced stuff like this. So table 6.2, has the framing device. So accepting dominant interests is something that really just means I'm in the workplace, I have a lower position, I want to work my way up the chain, and I don't want to make waves. That's accepting dominant interests. And the explanation then of sexual harassment in that environment is that it's accepted or it's justified as a less important problem than other managerial concerns. So perhaps I am an upwardly mobile female. Maybe I've just been hired out of law school into a law firm, and I'm being picked up on a regular basis, or someone's making comments about my appearance all the time. Those are those things that are clearly sexual harassment because it's not something that would ever be reciprocated. But I may not make waves because I want to make partner at some point, and the CEO, has a reputation for turning a blind eye. So there's several different types of framing devices, like trivialization, sexual harassment accepted or justified as a harmless joke. That's very common as well. Also, sort of being able to clearly define what it is another thing. Is someone making relatively positive comments about my appearance, but then one day saying something negative, like, oh, you need to lose a little weight. To me, that's sexually based harassment because it's based on the idea that women's appearances are as or more important than their function in the organization. So I would see that as sexual harassment, but I don't know if the law would allow that as sexual harassment. It gets real muddy. And then beyond the law, it also depends on the norms in the culture. If the CEO does stuff like that on a regular basis, male or female, because women are pretty much just as capable of that type of sexual harassment, then it's very unlikely that without pulling a lawsuit, I'm going to get any attention put on that. And then that may, of course, damage my reputation in my region or in my industry. So there's a whole lot of points against that. Another thing that happens with women in the workplace and with other minority groups is the idea of a double or triple bind. So again, the traits that we tend to think of as feminine traits, whether or not they're actually feminine traits, are generally secondary to what are thought of as masculine traits in the workplace. And so we need to look back at Taylor's management theories and, again, the sort of patriarchal foundation, not just patriarchal, but what's the word I'm looking for? Class-based foundations of organizational life and organizational theory, and realize that at the time that organizations were becoming a thing, which they weren't before the mid-1800s, certainly middle-class women and above did not work in organizations. And women were certainly not managers in organizations. And so it's not a far stretch to think that masculine norms of that time, of the 1850s through the early 1900s, are what have formed the foundation of organizational culture. So this assumption that being overly emotional in an organization is based on this very antiquated way of being in the world that has socially changed quite a bit, but hasn't changed in the organizational world. So, and also another thing to point out is that women were not theorizing about organizations either. So when these theories were developed, they were not developed by women. So you don't start to see female theorists of organizational work until the 60s at the earliest. And that's the very earliest, probably not really till the 80s. Table 6.2 gives some good examples of ways in which organizations normalize. Okay, that was sexual harassment and domination, which we talked about. And then table 6.3 shows some really sort of interesting ways of the steps through which emancipation happens, where we look at the patriarchal or oppressive or hegemonic norms. There's lots of different words for the same thing. It just depends on if you're talking Marx, you say hegemonic. If you're talking feminist, then you say patriarchal or paternalistic. It's all the same thing. But anyway, it talks about the ways in which organizations normalize certain things. So like table 6.3, someone says, you need to get a real job. So the meaning, it says the privileged meaning is that paid jobs, typically white collar, through established organizations are the only ones that count. So a way to deconstruct this, and deconstruction is to look at all of the implicit judgments that are in that statement. So if white collar jobs are the only ones that count, then what doesn't count? Well, what doesn't count is child rearing, day labor, temporary work, caring for the elderly, volunteer work. None of those things are considered real work. Also, being a professor isn't considered real work. Just to put that out there, because then you're staying in school forever. So anyway, all of us have encountered these ideas of things that are where the reality is bounded by a set of expectations that we may not have questioned. So if you've ever had, when I was an artist, my grandfather would always be, when are you going to get a real job? And also, when are you going to get married? And that was based on this set of ideas around what a real job was and what it wasn't. And so historically, he never really had real jobs either. So I think it was probably why he pestered me so much. But real jobs in that sense of a real job. He was never a company man. And my father was never a company man either. And so there's actually this history in my family of people starting their own businesses, changing careers. But that didn't become a social norm until my generation. And so it's kind of ironic that my grandfather would be like, when are you getting a real job? And I'd be like, well, but now that is the norm. And now the older generations are really struggling because they were raised with the idea that they would have a job for life, and they don't. One other term that I don't think is in the book, but it is a good one to think about, is intersectionality, which is the idea that people have multiple identities. And some of our identities are privileged and some are not, and we have to negotiate all of that. So I am a white, middle-aged, short woman. And white is privileged, middle-aged, maybe, woman, not as much. So I have privilege that I was born into. I was born into, a middle-class family, educated. Those are all ways that I have an advantage over people who were not born into the same situation. At the same time, if you put me up against a woman who's physically younger and skinnier and fits the norms for attractiveness more, she has an advantage over me based on nothing except that. Or if you put me next to a man, certainly in academia, he fits what we think of as the norms for a professor far more than I do. And so none of those advantages or disadvantages have anything to do really with our choices in our lives. It's just the idea that we have different areas of privilege and different areas where we are disadvantaged next to the norm. That is not to say that if you are a white upper class male who is born into some kind of good financial situation and has access to education, that your life may not suck in some ways. It just means that from a structural standpoint, you got all of the cookies when it comes to privilege. That doesn't mean that your life is going to be perfect. It doesn't mean that you're not going to feel pain. I think sometimes the rhetoric around privilege ends up sort of creating this hierarchy of who gets to be the most pissed off. And you can be as pissed off as you want to because everyone's lives are difficult and hard. It's just that intersectionality helps us look at the ways in which we have advantages that we didn't work for and the ways in which we don't, which also helps us understand other people who may have been born with far less advantages than we were and have a little bit more empathy and a little bit more will to ask questions and look critically at how decisions are made, perhaps in our organizations or other organizations. So intersectionality, the theorist who writes about it, I think the most eloquently, her name is Patricia Hill Collins. And if you are interested in feminism and intersectionality, and for her, she writes about black feminist identities. So she talks about sort of having these multiple identities, but her perspective is really good and her writing is fantastic. So I recommend it. Anyway, that was a lot of different information. I think that you guys will have an easy time with the chapter because it's very well written. It's not the hot mess that the systems chapter was. And just to preview, the next two chapters are not nearly as dense as these last three were. I think those were probably the hardest chapters in the book. That is my guess. So onward, and I will see you in class. And please feel free to emailing me if you have any questions or if I was totally incoherent and you have a lot of questions. Thanks.